Okay. Today is Sunday, July 18th, 2010, and we're at the home of John, or as he's known, Jack Mimnaugh, who was a Marine aviator in World War II. And the only two people present are indeed Jack and the interviewer, Mike Van Buren. So we're going to get started by having Jack give us his birth date.
June 7th, 1923.
Okay. And we are going to be conducting this interview on the behalf of the Library of Congress and their local partner, Central Connecticut State University. So this has to do with, this interview will cover Jack's service during World War II. A later interview will cover his service in the Korean War. Jack, what was the highest rank that you attained?
Major.
Major, okay. And you served in the Pacific and in China, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you were always a fighter pilot, or did you have any other role before becoming a fighter pilot when you were in the Marines?
Originally, I started out in dive bombers,
Okay.
and later on, our dive bomber aircraft were the SB-2C was substituted with the abundance of Corsairs, and we went into what we called glide bombing.
Okay.
And also with the Corsair, you were not only a bomber, but after you expended your bombers, you could do interdiction and become a fighter pilot.
Okay.
The aircraft was basically a fighter.
Okay. All right. Okay, now what I'm going to do, okay, where were you drafted, Jack, or did you enlist?
I enlisted
Okay.
originally in the Marine Corps, and then decided I wanted to get into the Navy, and I had to have the dean of the college at Springfield intercede for me to get me out of the Marine Corps and allow me to stay in the Navy V5 aviation program.
Okay. And where were you living at the time that you enlisted?
I was in college at Springfield, Massachusetts, Springfield College.
Okay. Why did you join? What was the thinking that motivated you to enlist?
Well, patriotism was one thing. Another major motivation was my academic achievement wasn't that impressive, and I might have been flunked out of college, so I decided I'd better go enlist in the service.
Okay. And when did you enlist?
On December 12th, 1942, my mother's birthday.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Made her unhappy.
Okay. It wasn't the best birthday present.
No, it was not.
Okay, well, why did you pick the service branch that you did?
I originally enlisted in the Marine Corps, as I said, but when my roommate took me to Boston several times while he was enlisting, and I saw the pictures on the wall of the aviators with their scarves, and I thought that looked pretty nice. Perhaps I'd go there instead.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. Do you recall your first days in service? Can you just describe those to us a little bit, please?
The first days in service, we were located at White River Junction, Vermont for aviation training in Piper Cubs, and physically based in a school called Kimball Union Academy in Meriden, New Hampshire. And we would be bused between school and the airfield.
Okay. So your basic training was in New Hampshire.
That's where I started out, Piper Cubs, before going on to pre-flight school at Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Okay. So when you enlisted, did you basically have the option of choosing to try to become a pilot or get into aviation, and then later on they would determine whether you would be a pilot or a gunner, or can you briefly describe? the route you took to becoming a pilot?
Enlisting in the Navy, I was enlisting in what they called the V5 program, which was aviation cadet training.
Okay.
So I was slated to become an aviator right from the beginning, provided I successfully completed.
Okay. So you were, for a short period of time, you were in New Hampshire. Then you went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences there and what you did, please?
Having very unhappy experience with the Piper Cub, I disliked flying very much. I managed to get through it by the skin of my teeth, and when I got to Cherry Point, or went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, it was basically drilling and academics and a lot of athletics. And I would have preferred to spend the rest of the war running the obstacle course than to get back into another airplane, but nevertheless I went on.
Okay. So did you actually do any flight training when you were in New Hampshire, or was the first flying?
All the first flying was done in Piper Cubs in New Hampshire.
Okay.
And we went through 8 hours of dual instruction, and then you were expected, and did solo after your 8th hour. We probably accumulated about 30 or 40 hours in Piper Cubs, and had the equivalent of a private pilot's license when we finished.
But before you even went on to Chapel Hill?
Before going to Chapel Hill.
And then what types of planes were you flying in Chapel Hill?
No, that was pre-flight school. There were
Okay.
no flying at all. It was all ground school. It was semaphore, all sorts of code, blinker, and things that you'd never use in an aircraft, but we were required to learn them anyway.
Okay.
And but navigation was our big drill, and that was the important one.
How long were you in Chapel Hill?
Chapel Hill, we were there for roughly 2 to 3 months.
Okay. And where did you go from there?
From Chapel Hill, we went to Glenview Naval Air Station, which was called E-Base, E standing for elimination.
Okay.
When you arrive there, you're told to look at the gentleman on each side of you because he isn't going to be here.
Right. So it was a weeding out process.
It was a weeding out process. We flew 2 types of open biplanes. The Navy N3N, which was built by the Navy Gun Factory in Philadelphia, and the N2S, which was a Stearman aircraft. Both were fabric-covered, propeller-driven aircraft.
Okay, and how long were you there? This was Cherry Hill, you said?
Chapel Hill,
I'm sorry.
which was in Illinois, just north of Chicago.
Okay.
And I was there for probably 2 months. And in that time, we went through everything from landings and takeoffs to formation flying, acrobatics. Acrobatics was extremely important to us because it was what would prepare you for dogfighting later on.
Right. Okay. So how long were you there?
I was there for about 2.5 months.
Okay, so you've now been in probably for about 5 months total at this point.
That's about it, yes.
And then what happened next?
From there, we went to Corpus Christi, Texas.
Okay.
And at Corpus Christi, we went to several outlying fields. Originally, I went to a place called Cabanis Field for basic training in what was known as the Vultee vibrator. It was a low-wing monoplane fixed landing gear, metal aircraft. From there we went on to Beeville, Texas for instrument training, and that was in SNJs. The SNJ is the also called the North American. And We had 11 to 12 weeks of instrument training there, along with, of course, the synthetic trainer, the little box that you flew with as a ground school trainer.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, we went back to Corpus Christi and was reassigned to advanced training in Kingsville, Texas, again in SB2Cs, or I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, in SNJs. And there we went through an extensive amount of navigation. Again, we went through acrobatic training. We had glide bombing, dive bombing, and gunnery over the islands off of Texas,
Mm-hmm.
which are now very expensive condominiums.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, our completion, we were commissioned either as ensigns in the Navy or second lieutenants in the Marine Corps.
Okay. So you were commissioned as what?
I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And we used to always claim that the second lieutenants were the top 10%, and the ensigns could remain the bottom 90%.
Okay. So you were in the top 10% as far as you were concerned.
As far as we were concerned.
Okay. Tell me briefly, can you describe the difference between glide bombing and dive bombing?
Dive bombing is an attempt to dive as vertically as you possibly can. And the best way to get there is not to push over, because the aircraft fights to stabilize itself, and you're constantly rolling in trim tab to keep your nose down. The best way to enter was to come over the top so that you were scooping into your dive and could ultimately become vertical and release your bombs. The only aircraft in World War II that was a true dive bomber that could fly 90 degrees vertical was the German Stuka.
Okay.
Ours were just too stable and wanted to come back.
Okay. All right. So as far as gunnery, that meant firing the machine guns, I'm assuming the wing guns, and trying to see how accurate you could be with them? Or?
Yes, we flew air-to-air against towed targets. An aircraft would tow a target.
Right.
And we were taught various approaches, from high side, low side, over the top, but we were encouraged never to get directly behind the tow target, because you had to keep in mind that the tow aircraft was ahead of him.
Right. You didn't want to shoot the tow
And you
aircraft.
could, and that did happen on rare occasions.
So you obviously were using live ammunition, of course.
Absolutely. And we also flew against the target for our rear gunners later on in dive bombers.
Okay.
When I was in SBDs.
Okay, because those were a two-man crew.
That was a two-man crew.
Now, did you have just 50 caliber machine guns? Were there also 20 millimeter cannons on the planes?
Well, when we started out with the SNJ, we were shooting 30 calibers, which were like BB guns.
BB guns.
Accuracy was nil. In the actual operational aircraft, the first one was the Douglas Dauntless, the SBD. And that was equipped with 50 caliber forward firing machine guns, as well as carrying 500-pound bombs. And we also were armed with 2.5-inch rockets underneath the wing.
Okay.
So that we had a good deal of armament.
Okay.
Later on, when the SBD was phased out by the SB2C, we had 20 millimeter cannons,
Okay.
which were close inboard, because if they started to misfire, the torque could disturb your point of aim significantly.
Okay.
But we had 6 forward firing machine guns, the two 50 calibers, and the rear gunner had a twin 30 caliber on a swivel ring.
So he was your protection, basically, your rear gunner.
He was the guy that kept them off your tail, and he also kept you honest as far as when it was time to pull out, because his eyes were glued on the altimeter,
Right.
while your eyes were glued on the target.
Right.
And you'd get a scream to pull out, and it was quite a fade out to the scream, because invariably the gunner would pass out from the G-forces during the pull out.
Oh, wow. Now, how many 500-pound bombs did you carry, typically?
Basically, you carried one single 500-pound bomb in the bomb bay,
Okay.
and you carried 250-pound bombs. You could carry 3 on each wing,
Okay.
and still have room for a couple of rocket pod mounts.
So you basically had then the one 500-pound in the bomb bay. You had 3 250-pound bombs on each wing,
Right.
plus the rockets,
Right.
plus the machine gun.
Yes.
So you guys were really armed to the teeth.
We were armed. It was a heavy aircraft, and even a good landing felt like a crash landing.
Okay. What kind of fighting were they envisioning you doing? Did they expect you to be attacking ships as targets, or doing activity over land, or what were they thinking?
We practiced against our own vessels, which were highly armed, but we used miniature bombs, which would only indicate where they were hitting to measure your accuracy. Basically, we were taught to attack ships, but we also later on learned very definitely that we were going to spend more time, and I did in the Philippines, attacking ground targets.
Okay. So at this point, it was probably the latter half of 1942, would you say that's?
Oh, no. I enlisted in 42.
Oh, excuse me, the latter half of 43.
This was the early part of 44 by the time I got overseas.
Okay, so you spent most of 43 in your training.
In training.
Stateside.
Yes.
Okay. As far as the planes you were flying, the SBD and the SB-2C, what kind of speeds were you flying at typically?
The maximum speed in the SBD was probably about 200 knots.
Okay.
Or 200 miles an hour. I think we could get it up to about 290 knots, 290. The SB-2C was faster than the Curtiss Helldiver, significantly. But we were generally throttling back because we were more interested in endurance than we were in speed and getting someplace. We wanted time over target as much as possible. So we would generally cruise at about 185 knots.
And that would be to conserve fuel, am I assuming?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so you had the time over the target. Was the SB-2C also a Douglas aircraft?
SB-2C was a Curtiss.
It was a Curtiss, okay.
Curtiss Helldiver.
Okay, so that was the Curtiss Helldiver, okay. Whereas the other one was the Douglas Dauntless.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. I'm going to pause once more.
Turn it on.
Okay.
Before I went overseas, I went through operational training, dive bomber training, which we've kind of covered just outside of Jacksonville, Florida. And then I was at Cherry Point, North Carolina for a short while, and then went overseas from there.
Okay. All right. So after the variety of training that you had in Texas that resulted in you being commissioned, where did you go after that? Did you spend some time as a commissioned officer in Texas, or did you move on?
No, I moved on immediately to Cecil Field, Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay. And what did you do there?
That was my introduction to SBDs, which was our early dive bomber.
Okay.
And from I was there for a period of about 3 months.
Okay.
And went on to Cherry Point, North Carolina.
Okay.
And I was at Cherry Point for several months and then went overseas in 1944.
Okay. Do you remember when in 44 you went?
I think it was, yeah, it was the 1st of March.
Okay, so at this point you'd really been in the service for about 1.25 years before
Yes.
you finally got overseas.
Yes.
And where did you head to when you went overseas?
Went directly to the Philippines, and I was assigned to a composite, what they called a composite squadron. It was a variety of aircraft, and the war in the Philippines at that time was pretty much cleaned up, and we were basically doing a mop-up operation.
Okay.
And I was there for probably 4 months, and then we went up to Hawaii to form up a squadron for the invasion of Japan.
Okay, let me just pause for a moment.
Yeah.
If you went to the Philippines around March of 44, you said?
About that, yeah.
So MacArthur had already gone back in at that point?
Oh, yes, yes. In 44, the Philippines were pretty well cleaned up. We had already taken Midway, and the stage was being set for the invasion of Okinawa.
Okay. Because Okinawa wasn't until 45.
You know, the war was over. Yes, yeah, that's right, 45.
Okinawa wasn't until the earlier part of 45.
Yeah, 45,
So
yeah.
I'm just trying to keep the timeline
Yeah.
a little bit straight here. So you were in the Philippines for how long? Did you say?
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Let me get this. Is that off? I'd have made myself a year older.
Okay, you don't want to. Okay, we're going to just revise a little bit.
Yes,
our text,
please. All right.
Jack. And you were commissioned in 1944, the early part of 44.
Yeah.
You then spent a few months in North Carolina. Is that correct?
Cecil Field, Florida first,
Cecil
right after.
Field, Florida.
And then North Carolina.
Then North Carolina.
I was at Cherry Point for several months and didn't leave there until early 45.
Okay, and from
March.
then you went to the Philippines.
Then I went to the Philippines.
And how did you get to the Philippines? Did they have you actually, you didn't fly your own
No,
planes
no,
over, of
no.
course.
We were troop shipped over,
So you troop shipped.
and with multiple stops.
Did you leave from the West Coast?
We left from San Francisco,
Okay.
and on the USS Barnwell.
Barnwell. Did you have a few days in San Francisco of leave so you could see the city, or?
No, we didn't have any leave. We went from a troop train directly to the ship.
So you just troop trained across the U.S.
No, we had taken a troop train from Cherry Point, North Carolina to Miramar, which was a base just outside of San Diego.
I see.
From there, we were troop trained up to San Francisco, and boarded ship and went overseas.
Okay.
The ship went all over the Pacific. It crossed the equator. It came back over the equator again. There were warnings of Japanese submarines, and we continually zigzagged the whole way. So every place that you went was a long distance because of the zigzagging.
Okay. Would you say it took, about 10 days or 2 weeks or something to get to the Philippines?
We were aboard ship for almost a month
Okay.
before we got to the Philippines. So we offloaded in the Philippines,
Okay.
and that's when I got assigned.
Okay. All right, Jack. So after nearly a month at sea, during which time you were zigzagging to avoid possible attack by Japanese submarines, you landed in the Philippines. The Philippines at that point had been essentially retaken, and it was early 1945. Would that
That's
be
correct, correct.
Okay. Take us from there.
We spent probably 4 months, 3 to 4 months in the Philippines, basically a mop-up operation, particularly Mindanao, where there were still Japanese holdouts. And they were still armed and well supplied, and were continuing to be supplied by Japanese submarine.
Okay.
But after our 3 months operation there, it was pretty well accomplished, and we were then sent back to Hawaii.
When you were in the Philippines, if I may ask, did you actually do any bombing runs? Were you flying against those last Japanese holdouts, or were you?
We were hitting areas of known troop concentrations. Occasionally, we would encounter a small convoy of trucks, which we would readily destroy. And the sense of the war was that you were defeating an enemy that was already defeated.
Right.
And your sense of accomplishment was not very gratifying.
Okay. Did you ever? Obviously, the story goes that the foot soldier sees the enemy up close. When you're in the air, you're not really seeing your enemy unless perhaps you're in a dogfight and you can see a guy in his cockpit. But did you ever see any Japanese prisoners or have any close-up encounters with Japanese in any way in the Philippines?
I have a vivid memory of a truck being hit by a pair of 2.5-inch rockets and blowing bits and pieces and bodies.
So you actually were able to see.
You could see what you did in some form. Dive bombing you didn't see because your destruction was after your pullout.
Right.
But with the 50 caliber machine guns, I beg your pardon, with the 20 millimeter cannons and the 2.5-inch rockets, you could see the damage you did because it was well out in front of you.
Okay. All right. So after that, you went back to Hawaii. Why don't you tell us about that? Did you fly, or did you?
They flew us back to Hawaii via a chain of islands. We went down to Manus in the Admiralties, which was about as far from the war as you could get. And from Manus, we made our way up through the Solomon Islands, into Johnson Island, south of Hawaii, and then into Hawaii. But there must have been 6 or 7 stops on the way up, and we were in Hawaii, assigned to VMSB 343, that's Marine Scout Bomber.
Okay.
343, and with the objective of forming a squadron for the invasion of Kobe Harbor targets.
Okay.
In our war room area, we had the mock-up, a complete mock-up in magnificent detail of the harbor itself and potential location of vessels of various sizes.
Kobe Harbor was in one of the main islands of Japan?
Yes, it was on the southern side of Japan.
Okay.
And we were to go aboard ship, and did go aboard ship, and to be launched 90 miles east of the Japanese shoreline. and we wouldn't see the carrier again. We were, after our bombing run, we were to continue down the Bonin Islands, and the Navy was planning on having a line of picket ships in the event that we had damage to the aircraft, limited fuel, or loss of oil pressure or hydraulic pressure, and were forced to land. And to be picked up, the picket ships were going to be in relatively close proximity. So it was like a chain of rescuers waiting for you if we had to make it.
In case you had to crash into the sea.
That's right. And I think everybody in the United Armed Forces at that time could have kissed the Army Air Corps for their bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which meant that we were not going to attack.
Right.
And from there, since we had a ship carrier load of dive bomber Marine pilots that were only qualified to take off and not land again, what do we do with them? So they sent us into Tsingtao, China.
Wow. So that, in other words, your particular group did not have training to land on an aircraft carrier, but only to take off from one?
That's correct. We were checked out in a steam catapult on a Navy base, Barbers Point, I think it was called, right next to our base called Eva in Hawaii. Yeah.
Right. Now, had you gone and bombed Japan, you said that you would have, your goal would have been to fly down to the Bonin Islands?
Yes, down to the end of the Bonin Islands.
And where are they?
They're south of probably 100 to 125 miles south of the southern tip of Japan.
Which means they'd have to be near Okinawa, wouldn't they?
Yes, so you were on your way to Okinawa, but you weren't going to make Okinawa.
So the idea was that you would have landed
Yes.
on the Bonin, because we
Yeah.
had the Bonin
Yes.
Islands.
Yes.
Okay. So now you have these guys who were great pilots. They could take off from aircraft carriers, but not land on them. And you've been given the greatest reprieve of your life, probably, by not having to actually invade Japan, which would have been a terrible, bloody conflict.
Yes, the Operation Olympic was later projected to have been about a 60% loss.
I do believe that the Army ordered 900,000 Purple Hearts for that campaign, and those Purple Hearts still sit in storage somewhere. So that's
Thank God.
testament. Thank God indeed. Okay, so from there, in other words, you never actually set sail for Japan. You were still in Hawaii when the atom bombs were dropped. Is that correct?
No, we were aboard ship when they were dropped.
So you were very close.
We had just boarded ship and had started to sail.
So at that point, you thought the invasion was
And the first they hit first was Hiroshima. And so we were put on notice that the Japanese had been attacked with an atomic bomb. They described to us what the atomic bomb was because nobody had ever heard of such a thing before. It was unbelievable to hear this news. And then when the second bomb was dropped, they announced that there would be a surrender.
Okay.
And therefore we toured south of Japan and back up into the China Sea.
Okay.
The captain of the ship was going to take us into Tsingtao, China, but which had quite an elaborate port facility. It had been the Asiatic home port of the German fleet in the Pacific. So
during World War II, you mean, the Germans?
prior to World War II, there was an extensive population of Germans in Tsingtao, China, in the city of Tsingtao, as well as White Russians. It was quite a European cosmopolitan area. But the captain of the ship wanted us to take off because of the danger of floating landmines. We had sailors and Marines in the catwalk blowing up floating mines. We cleared a path downwind. The ship proceeded upwind. We downwind. We turned into the wind, and he wanted all aircraft launched. So we flew all of our aircraft into a strange area held by a Japanese Air Force called Tsingtao, China.
So the Japanese, even though the surrender was imminent,
even though the surrender had taken place, particularly in China, not the formal surrender, but in China. We had a formal surrender in China later on. But we landed in Tsingtao, China, that the Air Corps had bombed pretty extensively. And we lost probably 7 aircraft out of our squadron because of crater damage on the runway. The aircraft were repairable.
right?
And there were no deaths because of it. But we landed there ahead of the arrival of ground troops because they were tied up in not a hurricane, what is it in the Philippines, or in the Pacific Ocean. But they had a horrendous storm, and hundreds of ships were lost in the bays of Okinawa that were preparing to bring General Rocky's amphibious corps into China.
Okay, so were they Marines or Army that were going to go into China?
Marines.
Marines.
Army did go into China, but they went in the Shanghai area, as I recall. Marines were basically in the northern part from Tsingtao, Tientsin, and then Peiping.
Those cities were farther north.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so you were expecting Marines to land in those cities to not really occupy China, but to be stationed there.
They would have been, all right.
And take the surrender of any Were there a lot of Japanese soldiers still in China?
Yes, there was an extensive amount of Japanese soldiers. They were all ultimately peacefully repatriated. There was an enormous civilian population of Japanese in China because they were cultivating silk mills, particularly in the Shantung Peninsula area.
Okay.
So that when we actually arrived there, the best housing that we could commandeer was to double up with the Japanese to make them move into concentrated quarters, and we took over some of their very elaborate duplex homes.
Really?
Yes.
Because the Japanese had been in China since the early 1930s.
Yes, correct.
China in 1933.
31, or, yeah.
The early 30s in
Yeah.
Manchuria.
Yeah.
Was Tsingtao in Manchuria?
No. Tsingtao is on the Shantung Peninsula, which protrudes eastward into the China Sea, and directly north of the tip of Tsingtao is Darien, which the Russians occupied,
Okay.
which was another peninsula.
Okay. All right, so you're now in Tsingtao. I'm probably not pronouncing it very well.
We call it Tsingtao.
Tsingtao.
The proper name is Qingtao, or the Chinese pronunciation. And there's a very famous beer that you can get in a Chinese restaurant called.
Okay. So you were there, you guys have flown in, you've had a few damaged aircraft.
Yes.
And what is your role at this point?
Our role originally was to support the nationalist Chinese.
Okay.
There were several incidences where we were not permitted to shoot, but we did shoot. So finally our
To shoot who?
communist Chinese.
Oh, okay, because the communists were already, they had sort of an uneasy alliance with the nationalists, is that correct? Mao had a 1 million-man army, is that a very large army?
Uneasy is a very, very timid term.
Out and out hostility.
Absolute out and out hostilities. They were at war as soon as the war was over.
The Japanese were no longer the enemy.
Then the national, that they were at each other. And unfortunately, the Maoists, the Chinese, who were capable of living off the land, were far better trained and more dedicated soldier, unfortunately, than the nationalists, which was a corrupt government at best.
Mm-hmm. So you, what was your role in terms of interacting with the nationalists?
Basically, we were doing patrol work to protect the railroad lines and transportation routes. And we would report any damage. The Chinese would disrupt the nationalist transportation by blowing up railroad lines. Mm-hmm. Their favorite trick was to really not blow them up, save their explosives, and dismember a rail and just offset it so that the engine would obviously derail as soon as it hit the separation. Mm-hmm. So that we did a pretty thorough job of scouting both the highways and reporting damages so that they could be avoided or repaired. The other interesting and fun activity was very early morning patrol flights into the interior to find encampments of the Chinese communists. And on one or more occasion, we discovered them prior to their morning mess facilities, and I mean real mess facilities. And we contributed to it by, since we weren't allowed to shoot at them, we could buzz the hell out of them, and their only means of transport was basically mule or small pony. And you could see elbows and anal orifices all over the place, along with pots and pans, after 2 or 3 of us would make screaming runs over their head, the tops of their heads.
Could you send their horses and ponies?
Absolute panic. It was the most. We would run camera shots of it afterwards, and it was absolute pandemonium. The first thing you'd see was dogs quietly walking through their encampment, and then by the time you were turned around, at least troops were coming out of their hoveled quarters, and there were, I can remember seeing mules with huge pots, cook pots, on the side of them, and the mules going one way and the pots going another, and it was a successful day.
So you disrupted the hell out of them.
Absolutely.
Took away their peace and quiet from
yes,
the day.
Absolutely.
Okay. You told me previously about an incident where you were teaching another serviceman who was not a Marine pilot, is that correct?
Yes.
To fly.
Yes.
What was he in the Army? Was he in the Marines, but just not a pilot?
The individual was a Navy lieutenant.
Okay.
By the name of Chet Rice, okay, who was an MIT graduate and headed up a unit called GCA, Ground Controlled Approach. It was a series of 5 or 6 individuals, all with their own specifically located radar unit, and they were used to help guide an aircraft in inclement weather back onto the ground again, in early in advance of something as sophisticated as an instrument landing system, ILS. And Chet collared me, because we were roommates, into being his guinea pig and getting the radar units all properly located. And then it had to be checked out under more realistic conditions. but we weren't about to put a hood over our heads so that we were flying strictly by instrument. So we developed a method where we would keep the runway lights out. The field was not illuminated, and Chet had me make a number of finally successful touchdowns, but the lights would go on a quarter of a mile out so that I knew I wasn't headed for a crash.
Okay. But you also, as you said, gave him some
I gave him
flying lessons.
flying lessons. Okay. We would go out to a little outlying field that we would shoot touch and go landings, and Chet became quite proficient and thoroughly enjoyed it. On our very last flight out, which we didn't realize was going to be our last, we were making an approach towards the field, and suddenly Chet said to me, "Look at all the fireflies down there." So I immediately pulled the aircraft up out of his approach, and on each side of the runway were revetments, and the fireflies were flashes from small arms. They were obviously communists that were shooting at us.
Even though it was your runway?
Well, it was a Chinese runway.
Okay, you didn't realize they were that close?
We didn't know that they were that close, and they were only ultimately they were as close as 5 miles from our actual field, and able to attack it with mortars. But the nationalists did keep them at bay, but it took a lot of prodding to get the nationalists to fight a war.
So you saw that those were not fireflies? But
they were not fireflies, so we proceeded back to the airport, the field, and I didn't have a radio in the Cub, so the tower couldn't give me any instructions. We pulled off to the side of the runway at a bombed out brick building, loaded up the aircraft with as many bricks as we could possibly fit between Chuck's feet in the back seat, and we flew over the field again, this time not nearly as close. I don't think I went below 5,000 feet, but we went down the runway dropping bricks. We went one way, then the other, and home.
Okay, all right. So that was your sole experience fighting the communists.
That was my sole experience, not only as flying the communists, but having been a dive bomber pilot accustomed to vertical approaches. This was my first experience as a horizontal bomber, like a B-17.
Okay. All right, well, you were in China for how many months, would you say, about?
I was in China from the end of September. We landed long before the armistice. Okay. And we were there until, I was there until late May of 1946.
Okay.
At which time I came back. I was going to be assigned to instructor duty at Pensacola, and I asked if I could go home and be discharged, and I was permitted to be discharged, and returned to college.
Well, okay, and that in a sense concludes the chronology of part one of your military experience, but can you tell me, did you have much interaction with the nationalist Chinese? Did you get a chance to interact with them, or were you pretty segregated on your base?
We had little contact with the actual Chinese nationalist military. I did have the honor of knowing a former Chinese captain who had been released from the service and was made head of the local police in Tsingtao. And he lived on our base with us as well, and spoke very good English, well-educated gentleman, and he was a joy to go shopping with because he got me the best prices available.
Okay, so you had made at least one friend.
I had an excellent friend,
okay.
And he's the gentleman that supplied both Chet Hurd, my radio gunner, and myself with my Samari sword,
Oh, really?
or samurai.
Okay, so he had taken those from Japanese prisoners or bodies.
He had us attend the ceremony that took place in Tsingtao.
That was the surrender there.
Of the surrender, right.
So you saw some Japanese
Oh,
officers?
I saw a number of Japanese. One thing I left out was that I was checked out in TBM, the torpedo bomber, and was used by the OSS on additional assignment to take OSS agents into the interior, and they would arrange for the departure of not only high-ranking Japanese, but also German military and civilians who were part of a communications network that was set up in China.
Really?
And not only that, but I also had the privilege of bringing out a virtual convent, a Catholic convent of civilian internees who had lived there, as well as I brought out several nuns, and we put them in the Bombay with mattresses on the interior of the Bombay for their comfort.
These must have been larger planes then, I'm assuming.
The TBM was a larger plane. It was that carried a Mark 8 torpedo, a big weapon. Yeah.
So how many people could you carry out at a time?
We could get as many as 15 people.
Really? But what was the crew? Was it still only a two-man plane, or?
The TBM was a three-man plane, but I didn't carry any crewmen with me. It had a tail gunner above, and it had a blister gunner down below.
So you didn't need the gunners
We
anymore.
didn't need the gunners.
So you flew out people like 15 at a time? Are you
Yes.
close to 15?
But the amazing part about it was I took in on 3 occasions one single they weren't CA, they were OSS agents at that time.
Strategic Services.
That's correct. And they were the ones that went in, spoke the language obviously fluently, and they made arrangements, and then I would be told when to go in to the field to pick them up. The reason for using the TBM was not only because of its capacity, but it also landed in a very flat level so that the pilot could see forward, and it was easier to maneuver around cratered runways.
Okay. My understanding was that the OSS, if you will, kind of got in bed with Mao as well, because they anticipated that Mao might depose the nationalist regime. So were you taking OSS guys in to hook up with the communists?
Not to my knowledge.
But you probably weren't totally privy of what they were
I was
doing.
not privy to the politics of the environment.
I mean, a lot
but
of that was still, we didn't know it was
they were at that time interested only in getting out the high-ranking Japanese.
Okay.
And
To inter them, or to just get
they
them out?
were interned, and then we had after they were in and others were amassed, we had the surrender ceremony.
Okay. But you also took Germans out too, you said.
There were German civilians
Okay.
that were brought out. They were not interned to the best of my knowledge. I think they were, they had been actually prisoners of the Japanese. The commandant of their compound I met personally, and he spoke English.
The German, you mean?
The Italian, or the Japanese commandant of their prison camp in the interior. But he was a very humane individual. He allowed marriages to take place. He allowed them to have their own gardens. He provided them with implements to do their gardening or to perform whatever skills they had.
These were Germans that were interned, though?
There were Germans, there were White Russians.
Because I find it odd that since the Germans and the Japanese were together.
But not all Germans were necessarily sympathetic.
Right. They weren't taking any chances.
No.
Because I know that during the during the Japanese slaughter in Nanking, the rape of Nanking as it was known, in the late 1930s, that there was a high-ranking Nazi official in Nanking who actually received much praise for trying to save Chinese from the slaughter by the Japanese. Kind of went against the Axis.
Several of the Germans were missionaries.
Okay.
And of course, the Japanese weren't very sympathetic towards Christianity of any sort.
So it didn't matter if they were.
So I don't think it mattered. But I do know that particularly one husband and wife, were German, although they were part of a religious organization. Yeah.
You helped get them out?
Yes, yes.
That must have been probably one of your more fascinating experiences was to...
It was, but it was hair-raising in that you wanted to get them out safely after what they had been through.
Right, you wouldn't want to see anything happen at the end after all of that.
And that runway was not the most encouraging departure.
Okay, so you left China in early 1946.
Yeah.
You were slated to be an instructor in Pensacola, Florida, but you requested a discharge from the military and you returned to school in Springfield?
Springfield College.
So you picked up where you left off, kind of.
No, I didn't. I had left off so badly, I started all over again, right from scratch.
Okay, and it probably came out well that time.
I did graduate.
Well, you had to have been sort of a more worldly wise and mature guy.
I think
all that you went through?
Yes.
I would imagine.
And it was just a few months after that, and I was back in for the Korean War.
Right, a few years, I guess.
Yeah.
But pretty close. Okay, well, that's an excellent summing up of the chronology of everything that you did. But let me now ask you just some questions about your life in the military that's irrespective of the chronology. While you were in your training and then when you went overseas, did you stay in touch with your family, do a lot of letter writing and communicate with your parents or brothers and sisters?
Yes, my mother was a widow. My father passed away when I was 13. He was a veterinarian in northern New York State, and we relocated to Connecticut to be with her relatives. And she, just prior to my entering the service, or as I was entering the service, a dear friend of my father's, who was single, asked for my mother's hand in marriage. And it worked out to be marvelous because it kept her mind more occupied on other things than me. But yes, we were in constant communication, and if I neglected writing, I'd get a package of postcards already with the postage on it, telling me, send your mother a note.
Oh, okay. Did you have brothers and sisters, by the way?
No, I have a half-sister who was born just as I graduated from flight training.
So you basically were an only child.
I was an only child.
Okay. A few questions is somewhat lighter in nature. When you were in the service, what was the food like? Were you satisfied with the food, or?
I never could get enough, frankly.
Never get enough. Okay, so you had a very hearty appetite. You didn't get enough.
With the workouts they gave us, yes, I had a hearty appetite.
Okay, all right. You seem pretty slim and trim now, so I guess you're someone who can just kind of process all that stuff pretty easily. Do you feel like you always had a lot of all the supplies you needed? Did you ever feel like there was something that you were always in need of, or do you think you were pretty well taken care of?
I think we were very well provided for, and not only by the military, but whenever we were in transit, there would be people lined up along the roads or along railroad tracks. If they were out,
Stateside, you mean?
civilians in the United States waving to you. I found the Midwestern people to be so friendly, and so everywhere I went, I think our citizenry were just marvelous, and the service took care of us, and the country took care of us.
Well, that's fantastic. Tell me about feeling pressure or stress. Was there ever a time, probably when you were overseas, when you did feel a lot of stress and pressure, or were you just so busy with the adrenaline going all the time that you never really felt it?
Mike, I really, I can't. I'm sorry, I can't.
That's okay. That's okay. No, I'm sure. I mean, every person's stress is very personal, so we can leave it at that. I mean, obviously, you kept yourself going during some very trying
I did.
times, and that's good. So that means you dealt with your stress, and that's what really matters. Did you do anything for good luck? Did you have something you carried with you all the time? Something from your mother, or?
No, I never believed much in charms.
Okay. What did you guys do for entertainment? Play a lot of cards, drink some Canadian club, as you were saying, or?
Well, we had ample opportunities to date when we were in training, and the Navy would bring in young ladies for dances.
Like a USO type
Yes.
Okay.
And we weren't permitted in the USO, either as cadets or commissioned officers. There was, unfortunately, a class distinction. The USO was for enlisted personnel.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of that.
And midshipmen were not considered to be enlisted personnel per se.
Okay.
You were an officer in training,
Okay.
or to be an officer.
Okay.
And but they would bring in young ladies from various local schools, finishing schools, and colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And we would have dances on our bases.
Okay.
And
Did you like to dance at the time?
no, I was never a good dancer. I danced with a young lady, and she was very lovely. But I was more interested in getting into downtown Chicago and to Lip's lower level, where I loved the bartender, a man.
Now, you said Chicago.
That was Chicago, Illinois. That was when I was stationed at Glenview.
Okay. Chicago was a neat town back then?
Oh, Chicago was a grand town. They couldn't do enough for you.
Uh-huh.
And but I danced with a young lady at one of the dances. My college roommate and close friend Paul Garofalo came over to be introduced, and I said, "Why don't you dance?" They danced together, and I left to go to Chicago to find a good bar with a couple of other hard drinkers. And Paul Garofalo, that was Paul Garofalo's first wife.
Oh, really?
They were married after the war.
So you were responsible for getting him hooked up?
Yes, I introduced him to his first wife.
Well, you're a good matchmaker then. That sounds good. Did you ever have entertainers at any of your bases?
Oh yes, we had
Tell me about that.
we had folks when we were at Miramar, waiting to be transported up to San Diego for our departure. Jack Carson, movie actor, big, huge guy, would get up these shows and bring them down to the base. When what they were really glamorous starlets. There were no Hollywood stars that entertained us, with the exception of he did it on one occasion. And Durante brought a group down one time. Jimmy Durante.
So you got to see him?
I got to see him.
Yeah, he was quite a...
Yes, he was quite an entertainer.
Yeah, well, that's pretty neat. What did you do when you were on leave? Did you mentioned going to Chicago to do a little drinking. Do you have any memorable leaves that you were on that you can tell us about?
This is not a confessional. I am not going to tell you what I did on leave.
Okay, well, but it's only the stuff that you're not too embarrassed to share. But
well, they're really the areas where Marine bases were located didn't provide the greatest glamour, I'll tell you. North Carolina, the nearest town was New Bern, and there wasn't an awful lot there. We weren't allowed to fraternize with our enlisted women, of course, but we would cheat a little bit once in a while and meet somebody off the base.
Right.
Because you didn't know anybody in town.
Sure.
And you were kept so busy, you might go to a movie or something, but that was a waste of time because you had better movies on the base.
Right. Did you ever have sufficient leave time that you were able to go home and visit your mother?
Oh, I went home on one occasion.
Okay.
Shortly after graduation, I was able to go home, and that was the first time I saw my half-sister, who was then, probably 4 or 5 months old, a couple months old.
Now, when you say half-sister, was that your mom had already remarried?
My mother had remarried.
And it was her young
It was
child.
she, yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you recall, although you've already told me about one very humorous event, can you recall any other rather humorous or unusual experiences that you had? Because even during war, there can be humor. We've already talked about the bricks, which is a great story, but...
I'd have to go back to Kimball Union Academy and White River Junction, Vermont.
Okay, I know White River Junction quite well, because I went to Dartmouth, and that's right around the corner.
Well, White River Junction had a little airport, and now that airport is across the river in Lebanon, as you probably well know.
Yeah.
But it was just barely under construction when we were there in early 1943. And we would be bused from Kimball Union Academy in Meriden, and everybody would be singing and happy about going to fly an airplane. And I'd be in the back of the bus hoping and praying for rain or snow or anything that would keep us on the ground. I absolutely hated flying. And at that point. And it was a challenge for me to get the thing off the ground without an accident. The aircraft always wanted, as soon as I got airborne, always wanted to crash into the hangar. And my instructor did give me the authority to go solo, and he said, it's been a rocky road for you, but I think you can make it. He took his parachute out and threw it on the runway, and he came back to the aircraft, and his parting words were, now look, he says, it's your life, it's Bugby's airplane, and it's my job, so bring it back. But it was typical of his lack of confidence in me, I think.
Well, you managed to make everything happen okay. What did you think of your fellow officers and soldiers? Does anybody stand out as being a really exemplary person that you remember well to this day because of their character or personality? Or
well, the most exemplary person I've ever met in the Marine Corps wasn't until the Korean War.
Okay. Well, we'll save that story.
Yeah, save that story.
We'll make sure to hit on that.
The people during World War II weren't all that impressive, or I wasn't that impressionable.
Okay. Okay. Did you keep a personal diary or anything while you were
No.
overseas? Okay. All right, well, we're going to go through a few summing up questions, and I very much appreciate your patience. Do you recall the day that you got discharged? Do you remember where you were? I assume, did you actually go to Florida first and then?
My discharge didn't take place until 30 days after I was home.
Okay.
Because they paid you for going home and they gave you a month's pay, even though you were in civilian clothes. So there was no formality to it. It just took place on that particular day of the month.
Okay, and by then you were back in Connecticut.
I was back in Connecticut, right.
And what town was that again?
New Canaan.
New Canaan, okay, and that's further south from here.
That's in Fairfield County, right.
Right, okay. All right, so you were discharged, and at that point it was the early part of 1946. How quickly did you get back into college? That fall, or?
I called and I got a hold of a gentleman by the name of Dean Merriam. Mm-hmm. He was the gentleman who got me out of trouble with the Marine Corps originally when I was enlisted in 2 services simultaneously. And Dean Merriam had a clear recollection of who I was, and I told him what I had accomplished since last seeing him as far as flight training was concerned. And yes, by all means, we'll send you an application, but it's automatic. You will be enrolled.
But you started as a freshman.
And I started all over as a freshman, and I went back in early August in time to be in for early football practice.
Oh, you played football?
I attempted to play football, yeah.
Okay. And what was your major when you went back to school at that point?
Education. I was basically trained in biological sciences.
Huh. Okay. Did you use the GI Bill?
Yes, I did.
And that helped you tremendously?
It was my salvation. As I was back in college in August. Met a young lady in October. We were married in January of the following year, 47. And that was the smartest thing I did because I don't think I would have ever completed college. I would have played the playboy role, but she kept my nose to the grindstone.
That's good.
Yeah.
And then you went on to have how many children?
We had 4 children. I had 3 boys and 1 girl.
Okay. Are they in Connecticut now? Are they scattered everywhere? Sort of?
They're scattered a little bit. One is a policeman here in Simsbury who lives in New Hartford. He's my number 2 boy.
He's not retired yet?
He's not retired yet. Number 1 boy is vice president of a major Japanese trading company, and he's located in New York. The only millionaire Mimnaugh in the world. And
ironic that it's a Japanese company.
Yeah, isn't it? But I drive a Japanese car, isn't that ironic?
There's a lot of irony at this point.
But anyway, and my daughter is an artist, and she lives in Annapolis, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
And my youngest is a Catholic priest who is a Franciscan friar. I paid 4 years of college at the University of Vermont. He studied economics. He then went on and got a master's degree in banking, and then decided he wanted to become a priest, and he went through 8 years of divinity school. Wow. And was ordained last year.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And how old is he now?
He's about 40, I think.
Okay. Okay, so your children have a spread in their ages to some degree.
Yes, my wife said we had children like the 7-year itch.
Children like the 7-year itch, okay. Did you maintain any friendships with fellows that you met during the service?
Yes, I am in constant touch with a a gentleman by the name of Paul Garofalo, who had been my roommate in college, and the one responsible for convincing me to get into the Navy flight training program. And the other one is another former Navy pilot, Bob Powell, and his wife Susan, who Nancy, my wife, and I are very close to, visit back and forth occasionally. But they're the only two that are remaining these days.
Although you said you did remain friends with Chet, your gunner, until he
Chet,
passed away.
he passed away about 4 or 5 years ago.
But he remained a good friend until
He did, yes.
he's the gentleman in the picture you
That's
showed,
correct.
who got the jacket for the Canadian
He got
Club.
for the bottle of Canadian Club.
Smart guy. Now, do you belong to any veterans organizations? I think you said the China Marine.
I belong to the China Marines, and I haven't been active at all. They have a reunion coming up this October, and Nancy and I are making plans to attend that, at the same time visiting friends in Chattanooga. I'm a member of the Marine Corps League, but not active at all.
Okay.
And they're all so old, I don't want to be bothered with them.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay, so what did you go on to do as a career? I know you've told me before, but please refresh me after you finished school.
Well, after I finished school, I was with Chicago Southern Airlines for a short while in marketing, and then called back to active duty for the Korean War after about a year with them. And that was in late 41, 42. And
Don't you mean
for the Korean War.
right, 51, 52.
51, 52.
Right.
And after I was obliged to spend 1 year in the Marine Corps for the Korean War, but I actually spent 3 years and was rewarded with some aeronautical training that qualified me for my next job in civilian life, which was a test pilot with Sikorsky Aircraft.
Oh.
So
And how long did that go on?
that went on for close to 10 years. And then I decided that there might come a time when I couldn't pass the flight physical, so I moved from flight test into aircraft marketing, and I've been in the aircraft business my entire life.
Oh, okay. That's neat that you had that continuity. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few summing up questions. Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, yes, it certainly has. It informed me, it educated me as to the military. It's not the glamorous event that a lot of people think it is, although it may have some glamorous moments. There are political aspects these days that I'm connected with the military that I'm not particularly enamored with. I find that we have two kinds of senior officers. We have the warriors and we have the diplomats. And the diplomats get the cushy jobs in Washington. But, further than that, I would become ugly.
Okay, if we elaborated. But as far as you're thinking about war, did it lead you to conclude that, I mean, you probably drew the conclusion that war is hell, that it's a terrible thing, but sometimes it's unavoidable. It probably influences your thinking on the wars or conflicts that we're involved in today, such as in Afghanistan and Iraq, I would imagine.
Previously, we were under attack, and the wars were clearly justified in my mind up until we weren't really under attack during the Korean War. We did an intercession that I think was absolutely necessary.
In Korea.
in Korea. The Vietnam War, I think, was the beginning of our not belonging there, not accomplishing anything, and the start of our and the continuation of our retreat from war. And we will retreat ultimately from this mess, and with no dignity, and unfortunately no significant accomplishment, in my opinion.
Plus a lot of loss of life.
That's exactly right.
How would you say your service experiences affected your life? Is there, in a broad sense, can you sum that up? How it formed you as a person, I guess you could say?
I think it's made me, and Nancy would agree with this, a little bit more rigid in my attitude. My expectation of people is probably, I expect too much, and I'm frequently disappointed in individuals. I've met some people that I admire, but fewer than I dislike, I think.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't covered in the interview? Any comments you'd like to make?
Not at this time, no.
Okay.
Mike, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, you've told us some very fascinating stories in your trajectory through the military, even though it was more toward the end of the war, is fascinating, and I think it'll be beneficial for Americans to have your story on record, and for your family to have it on record too. So
I spent more of my time during the war in training for the war than I saw of the war.
Right. Well, I mean, that may have been true for probably many people,
Yeah.
quite possibly. It's just like they say, for every one person who's actually fighting, there are 10 people who are there to support them. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it's those few minutes of terror with behind that a backdrop of, you know, tedium perhaps, you know.
Yeah.
But we want to thank you very much for doing this interview on behalf of the Library of Congress. I've enjoyed it very much, and thank you again, Jack.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay.